I'm Preston Scott Cohen, the principal of a firm of my name, Preston Scott Cohen, Inc., here in Cambridge. Basically, very conveniently located for me since I'm also the chair of the Department of Architecture at Harvard. And it's a small office. It's anywhere between 8 and 12 people, depending on what we're doing. And our main attempt is to try to leap to a scale that's a little bit larger than what you would expect for a firm of that size, but to focus the entire firm on each building so that the team is quite well developed around each. Our project architect for the Tel Aviv Museum in our firm is Amit Nimlik, but he is also the project architect for the other museum, Taiyuan, and the new library in Datong, expecting to go forward on others as well. So he's been really instrumental, and though he's not here now because he's overseeing the museum, he had been with us for 2.5 years. We're hoping to be able to have him with us again now that the museum is almost complete. What is it? Wow. That's a very good question. I would say architecture is a coincidence. A coincidence. It's a coincidence of the will of an architect with circumstances that allow the will to have what it wishes, well, under those circumstances. This would be one way to describe it. But beyond being a coincidence, for me, it's a certain kind of intersection between particular things that we know to make buildings very exceptional. Those conditions that establish the exceptional. For me, it's the intersection clearly of geometry with certain material and construction issues. Material and construction circumstances, I could say. I don't know how much further I should go with this, but I would say another way to put it would be that it's a very particular coincidental relationship between the question about the building type, the geometry, tectonics, and material of those in that equation. All of that situated within a very specific social and political arrangement that will allow those things to come together in a very exceptional way. Only under very specific political and economic conditions can things be brought together in remarkable ways in architecture. That's the coincidence, actually. The role of the architect in contemporary society. I think it has to have something to do, obviously, with putting people into contact with the physical reality in which the social is played out. I mean, clearly architecture draws attention to that in a way that otherwise one doesn't think about it. So it's not merely to be the support for certain kinds of social activity or certain kinds of social condensations, to use that term. I think it has to do also with bringing people into contact with the physical circumstances with which they're framing those arrangements. At the same time, though, the choreography, the sequence, the relationship of different kinds of activities and the way people find themselves with one another in spaces. This is something that architecture enables, and so the architect is actually shaping the way people live. We cannot forget that it is doing that, and that in fact is what all of it is about. I mean, in each of the very particular programs of architecture, the way people are congregating, the way people are working in spaces. They're very particularly being transformed by architects, and we have to think about the instrumental effect of our forms on those ways of living. It's an interesting question about innovation, because it's a curious word. I think everyone aims for it. I think we've inherited this desire to be innovative from the 20th century, and where architecture was motivated as something we even would sometimes call the avant-garde, by something we sometimes call the avant-garde. Of course, it's a problematic relationship architecture has to anything like the avant-garde, because architecture always involves some degree of delay and the deployment of resources in circumstances that don't allow it to have the immediacy of something that we could call the avant-garde. So as far as innovation goes, clearly there is a lexicon, or there is a kind of body of work that has inspired and moved me to think in very particular ways the past of architecture, up until the present, but all of it is past. And we're trying to elaborate on the repertoire. We're trying to extend the repertoire of architecture, looking for new kinds of convergences, certain kinds of intersections and coincidences. I think we're always looking to push through our techniques other results that are derived in part from the memory and understanding of the past, but that clearly venture into new territory on new terms. Interesting. Well, there's the networking that involves the people with whom we are associated, the reach and the connection those people have with us and with everyone else that they are involved with. I mean, it's extremely important that I've been able to be associated with the numbers of special people with special knowledge in their various fields of expertise through working on these museums, for example, or working in Israel and China and the United States, working with different people with different backgrounds, and being able to move that in and out of the kinds of networks that have been established through the GSD and other schools that I've been involved with over the years. I think the connection between those who are the cultural producers, those who have developed the reception, the conditions under which architecture has a reception in the larger culture, that is, the theorists and the historians, the way that they have helped to shape my thinking has been absolutely fundamental. And there's really a network of people that are associated with that. It's a conversation, and it is something, if you want to call it a network, you can call it a constellation of individuals that have coalesced around a set of issues in architecture over the years. I mean, this has been going on for decades, and for me, in my own life, this ongoing discussion among the people in the context of the academy and the architects who I've admired the most, and many historians even outside the field of architecture, they have had tremendous impact on the way I've been thinking and developing the work. I mean, I think they have helped to motivate the whole ambition of the work. One's ambition is shaped by whether or not one imagines the work being part of a larger cultural project. And if there is a cultural project, that involves what you could call a network, or I would call a constellation of people that are gathering around, coalescing around a set of ideas and having discussions that cross all sorts of lines, whether they be, let's call them oceanic, or let's call it, that means international, or cross-disciplining, crossing from one discipline to the other, or from one type of context, like the context of the construction site, or the context of those people who work with software, people in different fields of expertise. those are brought into discussions when you're working on very large buildings. They must converse with one another. So you end up seeing what you call a network developing between very many different, a very diverse cast of characters. The internet. I don't know if it's more important for us than others. I mean, I think it enables, as you know, this kind of communication, this instantaneous and extraordinarily efficient and I think opportunistic. You know, obviously we have been able on so many occasions to use it opportunistically. More than anything, though, there's no question that the immediate way in which we can communicate in working internationally has transformed for us everything. If not for that, I don't know how we would have worked. I don't know how Louis Kahn built those impressive works in places like Dhaka. I don't understand how he managed it. But we have been able to do things, you know, extraordinary things with this. Most difficult, though, has been to overcome the habits, for example, in China, of the leaders believing only that personal contact is the means for developing the work and for meeting and moving to the next step. They need symbolically to have me there personally. I've had to travel very extensively to China, which has been very, almost debilitating, having to go there 8 times in 1 year last year, for example. But still, on a daily basis, the communication with China, with Israel, has been, you know, something invaluable. It also means, of course, that we're working a very peculiar schedule, that we don't have an office in the conventional sense that one would have in the past, that people are working at home, people are at 1 a.m. having to make calls for a meeting at 1 p.m. in China. The kind of sense of time, as you know, is altered a sense of time is altered very radically by the kinds of communications involving continuous meeting with and deadlines with people in Asia, particularly. Well, these things are true for everyone who's doing work in that part of the world. I couldn't make any claims that we have extracted from the medium of the internet anything that anyone else hasn't, to be honest with you. That might disappoint you, but I think we're part of an evolving field. I think it dissolves the boundary between the office and the consultants, the office and the client, the office and the contractor. I mean, the contractor's trailer is really an extension of our office at this point, to a large extent. I still recommend the very old-fashioned becoming fascinated and obsessed with the actuality of buildings, with the immediate contact with built reality, with cities, and with traveling to cities that are moving and of significant interest to you personally. I mean, I think it's this personal attraction to the physical world of buildings that is really significant. And I think then to just immerse yourself in making a world of your own, and by whatever means. I mean, I have to say, though, that I am biased, and I have a very sympathetic relationship in my observation of the empowerment of people by means of modeling. And I think if you can teach yourself to model using a program like Rhino very early, at a very young age, you will suddenly encounter this extraordinary understanding. I mean, just by virtue of the fact that you have to extrude, for example, surfaces or assemble fixed elements, you will encounter the reality of inventing according to this kind of discipline that comes from having to learn how to use the software. And at the same time, if you're observing and engaged in the physical world of buildings, just by virtue of your own intuitive engagement with them, I think you'll enter into the problem of design differently than if you were mandated by any particular professor. You will have done it on your own terms. And that's one thing. The other is clearly to be someone who is constantly reading. I mean, I can't tell you how important it is to be immersed in discursive, intellectual, just being intellectually curious is so fundamental to being an architect. You have to kind of arrive to it through thought that is not necessarily instrumental. You have to take pleasure in learning for its own sake, not only to build skills toward a successful career. This is not something for people who are only careerists. You have to have obsessions about it. You have to be personally, attracted to it, and it's a problematic field because it's both very practical and a very artistic endeavor, and that means both to be practical and very have a very personal a personal encounter with these things. I don't know if that will help any student who's beginning to think about architecture, but I would say a lot of reading and a lot of observing the physical world, which will mean traveling and which will mean making things in some way. Both. You have to do both. You have to be constantly in the world. I mean, out in it as much as you can. Well, of course, there are many different ways to store it. I mean, some of the people I've observed starting have gained so much by having been a project architect, and I think the art of the project architect who is deeply invested in how to put a building together, very seriously preoccupied with everything from the way the wall meets the floor to the way these HVAC is going to be integrated with structure. I mean, and also of course finishes and whatever else it may be that is entailed. Certainly at the level of engineering, we could be speaking about the most difficult challenges. The most exciting challenges are I believe, in the stage in which you're confronted with the engineering. Those people, though, that have been the project architects I thought many of them found that to be the best way to move into their own practices. On the other hand, there are people, maybe a bit more like me, who did not find their way into it by means of construction, by means of the practical application to a project. Instead, I found my way through making hypothetical proposals. They weren't even proposals for clients. Now, this is a kind of risky way to suggest to begin a practice because it definitely, first of all, will require support by other means. And I moonlighted. I was working for a firm while I was designing my own projects. I wasn't even teaching, and eventually there was a kind of conflict of commitment. Clearly, here I was really with my passions in my own works and trying to work for an office. This wasn't going to work, and so I began to teach. Teaching is a means also to develop a thought process and a way of thinking critically, and it works back into the practice. And so these projects continued that way. How it is that I ended up beginning to actually do projects, someone had to find me. I mean, it was just by a fluke. It's just a good fortune, and I'm not sure if there is a formula to get one there. In this country, it's very difficult. It took, this woman, Elise Goodman, who wanted to do the barn house, who discovered a house I had designed that was in an exhibit at the MoMA. And she said, I want to do a house. Well, I really like your house in the MoMA. There's just one catch. I want you to put a 19th century barn inside of it. So, this house had not very much to do with, it seemed to me at that moment, she was really asking me to do something that had little to do with the kind of work that I had been doing. But that's not true, because I also was interested in historical typologies. And so actually it was quite fitting, and she understood it. But nonetheless, I think being discovered is not something you can count on. So some people are more proactive. It depends on your interest. If you enjoy making, if you enjoy the process of putting a building together, I would take seriously the possibility that you work through that process with an architect already with an office, and then you find your way into the field with that kind of depth and breadth of knowledge. The other approach is to work through it by finding a relationship between teaching and a practice which involves experimentation. These are the two models that I think, in the United States, clearly these are the best models that I know. I mean, of course, there are partnerships that are forged. Opportunities come about where one person has the kind of wherewithal, has the means to be entrepreneurial, and the other is more the maker, the pragmatist, or the negotiator, and another is purely a designer, an obsessive theoretician of design, and three people like that can come together. It really will depend on what kind of expertise you need to draw on, and whether or not forging a partnership is the best mode. This is another question you have to work with. It really differs from person to person how to get to go from practicing with others to practicing alone, or in a partnership of your own.